So we're going to go through a short history of open source. We're going to start actually with pre-internet days. And when I think back on it, the preconditions for open source are you have to have the same hardware or same operating system in order for any software to be shared. And then you also have to have some sort of distribution media. So in the early days, your distribution media were punch cards or paper tape, which is just an extension of punch cards, or you had 9-track tapes. The first open source, and this is actually agreed upon by most computer historians, was Captain Hopper's A2 system, which was developed for UNIVAC. And the idea was that UNIVAC users would contribute back to the A2 system any procedures, modules that would be useful to the community at a large. And they did this for quite a number of years. And this went into the development of these user groups. You had bundled hardware and software, and so you went to the user group for the computer manufacturer that you belong to, like DECUS for the Digital Equipment Corporation and Share for IBM. And software was freely exchanged at these user groups, usually through 9-track tapes. An example of this was when I was an undergraduate student at Case, my advisor, Professor Way, happened to have been Donald Knuth's advisor, undergraduate advisor. And so there was a time when Donald Knuth was going to visit the campus, and I was talking with Professor Way, and he was reminiscing about the time where he had gotten a tape from IBM Share, and he had handed it off to Don and said, "Hey, Don, I don't understand what this is. It's supposed to be a compiler. Take a look at it and tell me what you think." So Don goes away for 3 or 4 days, comes back and says, "Hey, Professor Way, I think I understand what this does. And guess what? There are so many things that I can improve on this computer program." It happened to be a Fortran compiler. And so he improved the efficiency and the speed, etc. And for many years thereafter, the Case Fortran compiler was considered to be the best, and that's the one you wanted to use. Pretty typical of the time. So turning into the legal aspects of this, the United States said, "Hey, IBM, you're becoming too much of a monopoly. We think that this bundling of hardware and software is anti-competitive, and we want you to stop that." So dragged on for many years, but eventually IBM said, "Okay, we'll stop it. And oh, by the way, now that we don't bundle, each item, the software and the hardware, are separate. Therefore, we get to charge more, right?" And we start to put restrictive licenses on that software. Now, during this period, software was not considered copyrightable, and software was not considered to be patentable. So the only protection you had was a trade secret. And then the U.S. Commission on New Technological Uses of Copyrighted Works, I forget their short name, they said, "Hey, wait a minute. Software can actually be copyrighted. It's really no different than a record or a film or a book. The media might be different, but software can be copyrightable. And therefore, software is a literary work. We can start to enforce licenses with various provisions how we want people to use that software. And the whole closed source business model gets started, and we start to have these different new products going out. Now, what is a license? When you buy software, you're not actually buying software. You're buying a license to use the software. And the media that the software comes on, yeah, you're buying the media, but the use of the media, it's just like a video that you bought for your home video. You own the disc, but the contents in the disc, the actual presentation, is licensed material, and you can't show that outside of friends and family. You can't charge money, right? You don't have any license to redistribute that work. The next protection that software started to have came up with Diamond versus Deere, and Deere was a rubber manufacturing, or they manufactured a uh, device that laid down rubber in a thin manner. And this device was revolutionary in that it had software components to actually do the software control loop. Now, the patent office said, no, you can't patent this device because it's software. And basically, Supreme Court said, no, software being a component of this machine does not make it unenforceable. But you can patent software. So prior to this point, any patents on software, in fact, the Unix set UID, set GID, in order to get the patent on that, they had to express it in terms of hardware rather in terms of software. So we got another protection for software at this point. At this time, Bell Labs was distributing Unix. So who is Bell Labs, and why are they giving away this Unix for free? If you don't know, Bell Labs was the research arm of the original AT&T. The original AT&T was under a consent decree with the federal government. They had to get rid of Western Union because that was a monopoly. They kept Western Electric, their manufacturing arm. They kept Bell Labs, their research arm. They kept all the baby bells, Ohio Bell, Pac Bell, Pennsylvania Bell, New York Bell, Southwestern Bell, et cetera, et cetera. And they made their money with providing telephone service. Anything Bell Labs put out was considered in the public interest, and therefore they were incentivized to distribute it for free. In fact, movies of the 30s and 40s, if you ever look at the credits at the end, you'll see synchronous sound by Western Electric, another invention that was given away for free because AT&T could not, by consent decree, be in those businesses. This all changed when United States versus AT&T broke up the Bell system. Now Unix can become a product. There's no more freebies. You start to see maintenance contracts on Unix. And, it's all this government interference, supposedly for the greater good, turns into having these unintended consequences. This led into the Unix wars. So if you were around during the Unix wars, you would see all these competing Unixes that came off of basically research Unix. And you had two major splits. You had the Berkeley Unix and you had the commercial Unix. The Berkeley Unix, they considered themselves to be separate in that they derived their source from pre-copyright research Unix. So basically they said, it's fair use, it wasn't copyrighted anyway, da 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 da. On the other hand, all the commercial Unixes were licensed, and Bell Labs, AT&T, got some profit off of it. There were lots and lots of companies that were trying to sell Unix either for particular computer systems, HP, IRIX, Sun, etc., or as a product in its own, like SCO. Lots of standards came into play at this point. Most of them were, they're standards, but they're durable, competitive standards. I control the standard, therefore I have this competitive over all my competitors. POSIX tried to be a true open standard, but it became so watered down because everybody's, trying to get their competitive advantage. So Berkeley was distributed under the BSD license. What do you think the Berkeley University lawyers were interested in? They're interested in making sure that the university doesn't have any legal liability. They don't care about merchandising rights. They don't care about, making it a competitive product. All they care about is no liability going back to the university. So it's no warranty, no liability. Do whatever you want with it, but don't come back to us when something doesn't work. Another interesting person of the time is Richard Stallman. So Stallman has a printer driver that doesn't work. He gets really upset, and he's like, software should be free. And he means this in multiple ways. But he considers that software shouldn't be licensed. I mean, that's his basic ground of being, is software, when it's distributed, should not be licensed. And software is a matter of freedom, etc. So an attitude that goes with the times. And that comes up with the whole free beer versus free speech phrase. We mean software is free as in free speech, not software as in free as in we give away free beer commercially. Users should have the freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change, and improve the software, is the bottom line. Obviously, for commercial users, that's not a very palatable standpoint. Stallman creates a free software foundation. All the new projects are underneath that, and they create the GPL copyleft. There's three versions of the GPL with varying degrees of ironic provisions where they're forcing their concept of freedom on you. Media of the time, floppy disks and CDs. So we've graduated from the tapes to floppy disks. And many of the Unixes of the time were distributed on CDs. A lot of software started to get distributed on bulletin boards. So you download your bulletin boards using Kermit or whatever, and you'd be able to run it on your machine. Usually it would be BASIC or some interpretive language because, well, that's what the homebrew, home hobbyist laptops, not laptops, towers and what have you, were capable of. This is about where I came into the picture. I used to have software I distributed, not through a bulletin board. Well, no, it was through a bulletin board. And then, you'd have a post office box where you would accept payments. So it was shareware, not freeware. This is the age where Minix came into play. So Andy Tannenbaum had an operating system class, and he had this book for his class, and his publisher had a companion software disk, where the Minix was published. So that's why it was proprietary, because his publisher wanted the licensing rights on the companion software. Tannenbaum later changed it to the BSD license after he wrested control away from the publisher. And at one point, it was considered the most widely used computer operating system because it was actually embedded into the Intel Management Engine chip, which it may still be, but it was basically part of the chipsets for many generations of Intel processors. Now we're starting to get into the internet age with its various protocols. SMTP was the media for many patches for software of the day. I can remember creating a patch for an Apache module, SMTP, to the owner of that module. We get into the web, nothing more to say there. So Linux is an interesting one, right? So you've got all the Unix wars going on, and Torvalds doesn't want to pay for Minix because it was licensed at the time and you'd have to pay for it. So he, as a lark, he's creating a terminal emulator, and he writes on top of a 386 a kernel to run his terminal emulator and a couple other programs at the same time. And he starts to distribute it on Usenet, and it starts to take off. So Stallman says, hey, this is not just Linux, this is also new Linux, because all the userland applications were new projects, and the compiler was new project, etc. So Torvalds actually releases this under the GPL. Next software protection that comes along is Bernstein versus United States. So Daniel J. Bernstein is a graduate student. He wants to publish his paper called Snuffles, and he's not allowed to because encryption was considered a munition. And given that it was a munition and it's a competitive advantage for the US Army versus the rest of the world, they don't want to allow publication or export of any software that can do encryption above a certain capability. Now, the Court of Appeals basically says, yeah, no, sorry, software is free speech. And so therefore it's protected by the First Amendment, and you can't prevent the publication or export of encryption. Apache Server was one of the big changes that are coming into play here. As you have the web, you also need the web servers. Apache Web Server was the NCSA, which is the National Computing something. It's the computing lab in Chicago that's for high-speed computing. So they create the HTTPD server. Then a series of patches comes along. They create the Apache server out of that. And the Apache server was kind of interesting in that you could load new modules and change the behavior of the server as you created more modules. And like I said before, modules is where a lot of people started to see the open source. I contributed to a module where it was a web counter. And I noticed on my machine, the web counter was going back and forth. Um, and I realized, oh, this is a multi-threading problem. So I, created a file lock around the calls to Sleepycat database, modified the source, sent it to the author, and he's like, oh, yeah, you're right. I never saw it because I'm running on a single-threaded machine. Due to the success of Linux, uh, Raymond publishes a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Some people have various opinions about what he said there, but basically he talks about two different models of open source production. One model is you have the source available, but it's behind a closed wall that it's developed. And the other is it's developed in public and people can see how it's developed, and therefore bugs are going to be shallow, is the idea. More eyes on it, the less likely you are to have a hidden bug. Sounds great in theory. I'm not sure about practice. Because of this book, Netscape Communicator, Netscape wants to have a competitive advantage over the Internet Explorer. So they're saying, hey, we're going to do a source code release of Navigator. So we can actually give you the source code and you can look at the source code. And oh, by the way, here's Bugzilla. You can actually give us field reports of the bugs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, we want your modifications so that we can have the entire user public be our beta testers and our developers to go against Internet Explorer. They create the Mozilla public license, which also adds the patent retaliation clause. Because of this source release, they needed something to say, no, Navigator's not going to be free. It's just open. Particularly Navigator server. So their business model is they sell the servers, they give away the clients. So they needed a better terminology than free software. And Christine Peterson suggested open source. And there's this huge powwow where all the leaders meet up in Palo Alto and agree, yeah, open source is better than free software. Now, Stallman sticks to his guns because he fundamentally believes that software should be free. SourceForge, the first software foundry, becomes available. It has CVS, SVN, and later Git as its source control. It offers Bugzilla. It's got, at the peak, about 500,000 projects. It wanted to be the destination for open source projects. Unfortunately, its business model pretty much destroyed it in the later days. The open source initiative, a couple people were concerned about all these different licenses that are coming into play. You got the Navigator, you've got the BSD, you've got the GNU, you got, Eclipse. You've got a whole bunch of different licenses. Everybody wants to have their own license, and the open source initiative wants to make clear which licenses are truly open source licenses and which ones have gotchas. So they create these guidelines for what is open source. They also create guidelines for, and they create a directory for which licenses have what clauses, and are they truly open source licenses or not. And you can, they still publish the, I forget the name of there's the four-letter abbreviation for each of these licenses that they publish. So we standardize on the names as well. Apache starts to have other projects in addition to the Apache web server. They have the Tomcat, they have Apache Commons. They start with a whole bunch of Java projects, but it turns into a bunch more projects. And so they need this umbrella organization. The foundation not only created its own license, but it hosted all the projects. So they're doing all the web servers, all the tracking systems, all that infrastructure that a project needs. Eclipse was one of the first open source, freely available IDEs. Again, more around the Java community. And they created another public license for it. Java.net is a source foundry, or was a source foundry, and it was the trial grounds for many projects that would later hit the JDK or become part of other packages that Sun made available. I worked on the JDIC, which was the desktop interchange, included capabilities of displaying icons on the desktop and drag and drop and all those stuff that interact with the desktop that Java didn't have at the time was in JDIC. Eventually died off because of the Sun Oracle, the purchase of Sun by Oracle. Eclipse, IBM wants to shed Eclipse. They create the Eclipse Foundation, again, centered on Java development, lots of open source projects. It is based in Europe, and they started to go into the whole concept of industry consortia. So various industries that want to collaborate on standards for the industry usually go through the Eclipse Foundation, although Eclipse still does the Jakarta Enterprise Edition and the micro profile as some of the standards that they shepherd. Linus is told by his source control company that he can no longer use that source control for free. You guys are starting to trample on our market share, and so we no longer want to give you a free license. And so Linus, over the next few days, creates Git and starts self-hosting Git, and it becomes his design criteria are here, and it obviously has become the de facto standard for source control. Git is also under the new public license. Now the transition of media is into just the ether, just over the web or over various networks. We no longer have to carry that floppy from desktop to desktop. Google Code Project was another foundry, and this originally was just due to support their Summer of Code projects, but they opened it up to any open source project. Again, the usuals, the bug tracking, the source control, the website, etc. And Google Code shut down basically because GitHub was so successful. GitHub started like the year after Git became available, and it was just a bunch of folks up in San Francisco who said, sure, we ought to have a project around this, and we need to source our own host our own projects, and we can make some money at this as well. And so they have a freemium kind of business model as well. The next big event in the software protections is the Oracle versus Google. It's a series of trials and decisions about whether an API can be protected in a competitive way. And so Oracle contends that Google incorrectly used Java APIs in Android. And so you've got a copyright and a patent infringement. So the first ruling was that APIs are not copyrightable, and that the jury found that there was minimal infringement, so no damages. Oracle comes back and basically gets up to the federal court, and the Federal Circuit Court says, yeah, APIs are copyrightable. And hey, by the way, that small infringement wasn't so small. Gets up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, well, and it's interesting, the whole set of amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs. We had just about everybody except Oracle creating a brief to the court saying, hey, if you settle for Oracle, then our business model is really going to be affected. And in fact, even Microsoft, the most anti-open source company of the time, said, hey, this is really going to disturb our business model if you do this. Supreme Court ruled that APIs serve as an organizing function. So they basically bypass the whole question of whether it's copyrightable or not, and just said, hey, Google's use of the API was fair use. And there's a lot of distinctions there, but it's a win for the open source community in that you can't claw back an API. If you could, then you could go back to Linux, because Linux was created it's a clean room implementation of the Unix APIs. And therefore, if you could copyright that API or patent that API, then Linux would be infringing on the original Unix. Okay, the next foundry we're going to talk about is GitLab. GitLab's interesting in that its actual code to run GitLab is open source itself. and it also runs on a freemium model. But it's kind of an after, it's much smaller than GitHub. And the last one I want to talk about is just Java itself. So Java was mostly open source, but not open source. So the source was available on a confidential basis. And basically that's legalese to say, hey, we can claw this back at any time we want to, and you can't use it. But later it became more and more available, and by 2007, it was put under the GNU public license, and there was about 4% of the source code was encumbered by copyrights of the authors, such as IBM, who did the original util package, and there were a couple others that were built into there. Now, interestingly enough, all the XML was actually the Xerces project, the Apache Xerces project. So there were a lot of other pieces in there that was not Sun original. In 2018, as Oracle is kind of divesting itself of Java, the whole the Enterprise Edition went to Eclipse, and the JDK and JRE is basically given to OpenJDK. Now, Oracle still does the major work on Java, but it's now much more of the bazaar model rather than the cathedral model.